That is the sound of a smoker, a beekeeper smoker. It looks sort of like an oil can with an accordion bellows tacked on. When a beekeeper needs to inspect a hive, they pump the smoker. How the smoke calms the bees is complex, but part of what's going on is that the smoke tricks the bees into thinking the hive is on fire. They react by eating as much honey as they can, figuring the honey will provide the energy they need to escape. But it makes them sluggish, and that means they're less likely to sting the beekeeper. Sort of like the scenario where you've just stuffed yourself with Thanksgiving turkey and then someone challenges you to a 100-yard dash. This special episode of Between the Rows is all about bees, and I'm your host, Christy Nuds. This show will range from the romantic, roaming the lavender fields of southern France.
I ended up becoming fascinated, and that's why I do teach the Le Monde Fascinant de l'Abeille, which is the fascinating world of bees.
To the prosaic, setting up Manitoba buffer zones.
If you haven't intentionally put a buffer strip in place to help support your natural predators, you're missing out on some great opportunities.
To the decidedly sci-fi, turning bees into tiny crop dusters.
And as the bees leave the hives to forage, during that process, as they exit the hives, they walk across our dispensers and they pick up in powder form our biological control agent.
We're wandering the world to understand how the most fundamental of farming creatures, the bee, shapes and is shaped by our world. So let's get started. Our first story is about Philip Pryor, an expat Brit apiarist, roaming the lavender fields and oak forests of the French Mediterranean. Pryor looks a bit like a latter-day Bruce Willis, if Bruce Willis spent his days tending over 200 beehives. We caught up with Pryor in France over the summer. He starts by telling us how it all began.
Well, if we go back again to the beginning of this, with my ex-wife, I was living with she was transfused and she was HIV. So I tried to set up the good life. We were growing crops, we were growing our fruits, vegetables. When I met this guy for bees, I thought, great, bees, propolis, royal jelly, pollen, all products from the bees, which would have been very beneficial for my ex-wife. That was the initial thought I had about beekeeping was, this is going to be good for our future. You know, we had our own olive oil, we had our own fruits and vegetables. And once again, I'm very passionate about the garden and olive trees. So it was part and parcel of that, but I will take it a step further because I'm not actually married anymore. I ended up becoming fascinated. And that's why I do teach the Le Monde Fascinant de l'Abeille, which is the fascinating world of bees. We have the start of the season here, which can be early, so we get ready in February and March. We have a plant here called the white heather, and that is one of our first big flowers. So I base my beekeeping around that flowering. So I get going in February, March, and I take hives down to the coast and fill up all my apiaries. And then when that floraison's over, then those hives get moved to lavender. Whereas my hives up where I live in the central VAR, they are close to me because I do actually do a pollen production, which is a certain time of the year where we have a lot of pollen coming in, so we can actually harvest it. And I do a certain amount of pollen as well. So the year is taken on by, we're directed by the bees and the climate. Once again, it's all about the flowering. So this is what we do. We move our hives into new areas. When one flowering is over, we go to another area for a new flowering. So that's how it runs at the moment. Whereas now, today, in August, all of my hives are virtually up at 700 meters. And that's not only for the flowers, that's also because on the southern coast here, we have the Asian hornet, which she's been hit with us now on the coast for over a month or so, maybe even more, 2 months. So we have this predator, this carnivore insect, which loves eating bees on the coast. So you're very wise to move your hives out of here and put them into higher areas to avoid getting depopulated hives from these hornets. So that's a new consideration that's happened over the last 3 or 4 years. And they will stay there because, if I bring them back down here, even though the flowers in the mountains will soon be over, they will get completely and utterly depopulated by this hornet. Well, we're talking of altitudes, I guess that's what we call it. Beekeeping, we do run a lot of our beekeeping around altitude. So I start on a low altitude by the coast. We're on low land. Around where I live here in the central Var is low land. We're like 300 meters approximately. And then I always try and get my bees up to 700 meters, which is considered mid-mountain, where you get different types of floraison. And that is one thing that has to be considered as well. And once again, another privilege we have here, we have 2 types of soil here. We have an acid soil and we have a calcium soil, which of course creates different flowers in different soil. So we have this privileged area where we can move our hives around quite quickly. I mean, when I go behind Nice, I'm a 2.5 hour drive from where I live. When I go to the Ardèche, it's a bit longer. The lavender plains, they are slightly higher. They're about 400 or 500 meters, so they're quite high. So we have this huge environment of altitudes, which give us all these different flowers and tree flowers and trees. So once again, it's a very interesting place for a Mediterranean beekeeper that I can actually go from one area for a type of honey, and I can go just a bit further down the road for a different type of honey. And that's, once again, very interesting in the world of beekeeping, because in some cases, you get coastal honey, like last year was an absolutely exceptional year for beekeeping. For me, where my hives were built up, and they were massive. Whereas this year, with our climate, they haven't moved on. And in the mountains, they're working this year, where they did last year too, but all my other apiaries this year haven't worked. So what I'm trying to say is that we have all these great diversities going on, but nothing is guaranteed. You can't say, oh, yep, I'm going to get honey. That does not work like that. It's so much to do with the climate that you can't guarantee anything. What a privilege when you have a huge harvest of a saccharose from wherever. You can't get away from that feeling inside and that respect that you can have for that insect. And that's why I really, really, really would, if I had a really big wish, would be to put into our educational system a thorough understanding of the bee. The thorough understanding of how actually fascinating she is. It's not just about honey, it's not just about bee stings. And I always believe that in this fascinating world of beekeeping, that if people actually did understand it, if they were taught thoroughly, I'm talking thoroughly, so they understand the life cycles, they understand what happens, what goes on, I think people would become far more sensitive to their way of living, their way of eating, their way of dealing with water, and a greater understanding with our environment. So I'm very happy to be in this privileged, and I always call it a privileged position, because we are dealing with what I consider as number one, the most important thing in our environment is the bee, because of what she gets up to, what she does. So I'm very privileged and very honoured to have her in my hands and to try and do my best with her, because it's not easy, let me tell you.
That was Philip Pryor, who is now happily back roaming the hillsides outside Saint-Tropez. From the south of France to Renfrew County in eastern Ontario, FarmTerrio's Matt McIntosh caught up with farmer, agronomist, and beekeeper Jen Dolman. If Pryor was passionate about the bees' honey, Dolman is just as driven when it comes to the bees' home. Dolman is an expert on buffer zones. This conversation took place last August.
All right, we're here with Jen Dolman today. We're back in Eastern Ontario in Renfrew County, and we got some interesting stuff going on. We're looking at some buffer strips, some pest management, and some different strategies as it pertains to insects. So, Jen, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Matt. I appreciate being here. It's kind of neat while we're talking. I'm watching the bumblebees moving around, so it's very inspiring.
Well, that's good. Hopefully it's not too hot. It's like 40 degrees down in my area, so we'll try not to keep you in the sun too long. So maybe
it's nice because I'm in the field, so I'm happy.
Okay, perfect. Let's maybe just start with just maybe tell us kind of where you are, what we're looking at, and really what kind of the role is of this buffer strip that you're standing in.
Okay, so Renfrew County has a lot of marginal ground and a lot of great farmland. And I have been a farmer for 15 years and an agronomist for 13 years, and now a beekeeper for 4 years because of neonics. So for me, I always knew buffer strips were really important when it came to like water quality and soil erosion, but I hadn't really realized how important it was for beneficials. So the buffer strips are really those parts of your farm that are not yet working at maximum potential, because if you haven't intentionally put a buffer strip in place to help support your natural predators, you're missing out on some great opportunities. So the buffer strips are those parts of your farm that the sprayer can't quite get in tight to, so you have a lot of burdocks growing. Anything edge of field. They're very good for neighbor relations as well, so you have less worry about risk. Anytime you can, have really any parts of our farms that when I'm looking at the yield monitor or I'm scouting fields and I'm not seeing consistent regular yields, it makes me start to wonder, maybe we should be retiring some of this and putting it into a buffer strip, because then I'm not putting inputs there. Mm-hmm. And I'm also creating habitat for some of my most important staff, which are my beneficials. They're great. They work on weekends. They work like statutory holidays, and all they ask for to do their job well is some food, place to stay, and us providing them with some really good snacks in our fields.
So when we're talking about buffer strips or trying to figure out where they might actually fit in the field in terms of like an area that's underproducing or it's something like that, are there any kind of general strategies you can use aside from maybe a yield count? Maybe you don't have a yield monitor or something like that. What are some other strategies you can use to try and establish whether or not an area could be transformed into something different?
Well, there's a few different strategies. One is go through and actually look at your fields right now, either in person, or you can do a lot even just with Google Maps. Or ideally, I always like it that you've got a decision maker covering the field at least 2 to 3 times a season. Like we hire scouts, we hire custom sprayers, all this other stuff, but you can have a decision maker in that field and just look and see, where is it really thin? Where do you have weeds coming? Like, where really do you have problems? And that's really a good place to start. And then there's different strategies. So an area that the sprayer never gets to, you can invest in some nice things like vetch or crimson clover, sweet clover, something that, can actually handle a little bit of Roundup, You don't want to be spraying Roundup in there, but it's not something where you have to go and replant every year then. Anywhere at my place where the burdocks take over, that's public enemy number one because they're just so invasive. But anytime you see the weeds creeping into the fields, the bared off knolls, it needs to be something that works for your system. There's no sense spending a lot of money on a cover crop seed that the custom sprayer is going to take out, right? So what you really need to do is find something that fits your goals and fits your budget. But I'm always a big fan of, like, honestly, one of the cheapest seeds around is sweet clover. It's incredibly tough. It seeds itself back down again. And it is really one of the best things for pollinators and for beneficials because it blooms all season long. It grows about waist high. So, you don't necessarily want it where you've got a high traffic area. That's better for things like red clover or white clover, or if you want to get into some exotics, things like Phacelia. But at the same time, like, these are great because they don't necessarily need to be mowed. Grasses are wonderful, but grasses do need to be maintained. Otherwise, they kind of suffocate out themselves. So grasses are good, but I'm always a big fan of anything that can have a flower because it not only gives the pollinators, which are obviously for me as a beekeeper, I love, but really the native pollinators are what's keeping a lot of our system in balance. So they need the nectar they need. The nectar provides the energy, it's the carb, and then the pollen is actually the protein. And so it's actually feeding things that are helping your crop as well, not just, the honeybees, for example. So for those buffer strips, start with the areas where you've got the biggest problems, because really, what have you got to lose? If you can evaluate and see, okay, I'm spending, this many hundreds of dollars an acre on this. Yes, you do have to still make the mortgage payments or pay the rent on that ground. Sometimes when it's rental, you can maybe have a conversation with your landlord and say, hey, listen, this isn't producing. And I know we both share a common value of good environmental stewardship. So if we turn this into pollinator habitat, this might be a really good opportunity for you to know that you're giving back. And maybe you can even get the landlord to help pay for that. But you have to have a good relationship, or you're showing the landlord how you're investing in their ground. Again, it depends on that relationship. And I'm not in an area with a conservation authority, but I do have a lot of friends that are. And sometimes the conservation authorities will provide pollinator or buffer strip seed, or have programs that you can apply for it and have some of that subsidized. And this way, it's not just farmers having to care for this. Like, we get the benefit by having the pollinators here, but we're also providing habitat for a lot of other species that are important for our whole ecosystem. And it's nice to make it so that we're just not the only ones having to care for that.
That makes sense. Actually, that's a good point. I know down further south here, there definitely are programs with various conservation authorities for that sort of thing. If we're talking about species specifically, walk us through where you stand. And you mentioned several different varieties of clover. What have we got? What are we looking at here?
I am a shaky walker, so I brought some plants to you. So some things are just naturally invasive, and like this is tufted vetch or ground vetch. You can get vetches in as a seed for cover crops. It's something where you kind of want to watch because it can become invasive. Really, for me, I'm able to keep most of my vetch in check when it creeps into the field just by having wheat in my rotation, because CPA really kind of keeps it in place. But it doesn't really take a lot of yield, and it helps fix nitrogen underneath the ground. So again, it's very case dependent. The sweet clover I talked about, this is what it looks like. You can either get red or white. And it's funny, I used to ask the local beekeepers which was the best one, and whichever one I could buy, he told me that I should have bought the other. So I think it doesn't matter. Crimson clover is one of my favorites. This is my favorite cover crop legume because it really, in Renfrew, it doesn't overwinter very well. It's got a gorgeous color. Even things like sunflowers, I have a lot of people calling saying, hey, I want to put some sunflowers up in my yard. How do I get seed? Because I'm also, I also have that available. And so for me, a lot of the time is just honestly go buy a bag of birdseed and plant it, unless you're planning on combining and harvesting it. Birdseed, anybody who feeds the birds knows that once anything that falls on the ground grows really well. It's got a nice fibrous root system. It doesn't overwinter. And I do know people who actually put it in their cover crops in the fall just because it makes the neighbors super happy. And so I just, there's not many things that make the general public excited about corn or beans, but when you put sunflowers or clover in a field, everybody's got, the warmth, it warms the cockles of their heart or whatever you want to call it.
Now it's time to move on to the outer edge of the possible. the nearly sci-fi, BVT or bee vectoring technology. What if we could piggyback technology onto a bee? The Manitoba Co-operator's Gord Gilmour brings us the story.
We've all heard the tale of the busy bee. But could you put a bee to work for you? One company thinks so. Bee vectoring technology is taking Canadian research and applying it to the problem of preventing infections in crops. But instead of using a sprayer, they're using bees to very precisely place crop protection products. Bee vectoring technology CEO Ashish Malik joins Between the Rows today from California. Ashish, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning, Gord. I'm very happy to be here myself.
So where did this idea come from?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the use of bees as vectors to deliver plant protection products has been studied in academia for actually quite some time, going back even a couple of decades. The idea to build a commercial system that would work with commercial agriculture was something that we pioneered. The technology, the ideas came actually out of the University of Guelph in Ontario, some late 90s, early 2000s, by a couple of professors who are since retired, who were looking at, on the one side, what are the kinds of products, the plant pathology side, that could be best suited for bee vectoring, and then of course the bee experts that worked at the universities that kind of put their heads together and came up with the idea of bee vectoring.
So now, can you just give me a sort of a simplified explanation of how it works?
So we work with commercial beehives. So we don't work with the bees that are, wild, you find in nature. So we work with the ones that farmers will either rent for the season to help pollinate their crops or buy, in the case of bumblebees, for greenhouse production primarily. So we work with those, we call them managed beehives. And we have dispensers that work together hand in hand with the bees themselves that get placed in those hives. And as the bees leave the hives to forage, because of course the flower represents a nutritional source for them, right? So they visit the flower to bring nutrition back to the colony to feed the colony. During that process, as they exit the hives, they walk across our dispensers and they pick up in powder form our biological control agent, which then, in a sense, we are cargoes as the bees fly to the flower. When they visit the flower, that's when the microbial product falls off their bodies, colonizes the plant tissue, and gives the crop protection properties that the farmers are looking for.
Well, now we know that bees of all types are very busy, hardworking insects, but can you tell us a little bit about just how effective they are at placing crop protection products?
Yeah, they're very effective. So you think about the benefit of our system. The bees are going to visit the flower alone, right? They're not going to go wander off. That's their food source, so that's their kind of mission, if you will. And so when you compare bee vectoring to traditional spraying, when you're spraying a crop, you're typically getting only 5% of the active ingredient onto the flower. In our case, you're getting 100% of what the bees are carrying delivered to the flower. So that it's a very targeted application. It's a very efficient application. And the bees are wonderful because they keep visiting the flowers in that same field day in, day out during the entire bloom period. So, farmer may be spraying once or twice during the bloom period, which means that any flowers that might open after a bloom, before the next bloom, are actually left exposed and vulnerable to a pathogen, versus the bees who are constantly visiting any new flower that opens up that gets, potentially a colony of the biological control agent colonizing that freshly opened flower. So very effective, very efficient, extremely targeted. In fact, we coined the phrase that this is precision natural agriculture, right? So it's or natural precision agriculture, I should say. So very effective.
And now I think I'd be safe to say that most of our listeners are going to be a lot more familiar with doing this a mechanical way. I imagine there must be a lot of other benefits, though, in terms of its environmental footprint and so on. Could you run us through some of those?
Yeah, so I mean, I've already talked a little bit about the effectiveness and the fact that you're in a very precise way getting the biological to where the source of the infection would be through the flower. So very efficient in that regard. But in terms of environmental benefits, so we are it's a natural system, so we don't use any fossil fuels compared to heavy machinery that could be used, or even crop dusters, airplanes that are still used for delivering traditional methods of spraying. So no fossil fuels is a huge advantage. We also don't use any water. So, for example, I live in California where we're dealing with droughts every year, 3 years in a row. Farmers have been rationing the amount of water that's available to them. So this eliminates all of the use of water for delivering crop protection. So they can apply whatever small quantities of water that they have for the nutritional needs of the crop itself. So that's another big advantage. And biologicals, because they have a less of an impact on soil and things like that, it's better also from a regenerative agriculture perspective in terms of maintaining a clean soil environment.
So now, where would we go and see this technology in action today?
So we're selling a product today that is registered as a biological fungicide using these bees in the United States. So right now, the only place that we have that regulatory approval is in the US. So we're selling it quite widely across the US, but we've started the process to expand geographically. Obviously, Canada will be submitting to the Health Canada and the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, the PMRA, over this winter. We're expanding into Mexico. We have expansions plans already started in Europe. And also we're looking at South America. We're looking to go into Peru. So very soon you'll see us expand our geographic footprint. But today it's primarily used on the berry crops in the US. But even in the US, we're looking to expand the number of crops that we could sell the system onto.
And that is typically where these kind of new technologies find their foothold, is in those sort of specialty and high value crops. Do you see a time, though, when we're going to see this technology become more widely adopted? Like, for example, would it be within the realm of the possible to see it in a large scale situation, like, say, prairie canola production in the next 10 years?
I think so, very much so. So we are already, so when you're talking about oil seed crops like canola or sunflowers, there's a disease that affects all these crops called sclerotinia head rot, and there are very limited amount of products that are very effective against that disease. Our clonostachys, our biological, is extremely effective against sclerotinia. And the great thing is that the bees love these oil seed flowers. And in fact, in many cases, honeybees are already being used in commercial oil seed production. So we have done work in sunflowers since we registered in the US. Most of our work has been on the sunflower oilseed crop, where we've been able to show extremely good control of sclerotinia. Work done at North Dakota State University. We've also done some work on the West Coast in California and Washington State. So our next stage, once we start the regulatory process in Canada and we get the permits to do large-scale trials in Canada, will be to also look at canola. But then even beyond these oil crops, we've got 1 million acres of almonds, which are planted in California. We're doing work on that crop. And, certainly beyond the berry crops, we have opportunities in vegetables and stone fruit as well. And those are all crops that are in our targets for the future.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to run us through some of this. It sounds like very exciting technology.
My pleasure, Gord. Yeah, we are an exciting growth stage for the company. We've got a technology that we believe for many, many crops is quite revolutionary, and we look forward to telling you more and telling your audience more as our business develops.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
That was Gord Gilmour reporting on the BVT revolution that could be coming your way. We've been saying bees as if there were one creature, but there's actually over 1,000 species of bees in Canada alone. Those species have different needs, face different threats, but one thing that could help a lot of them is shelter belts. GFM online editor Greg Berg spoke to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Melanie Dubois.
Melanie Dubois has a bee-centric approach when it comes to her research. As senior riparian and biodiversity biologist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Brandon, Manitoba, Dubois and her team are studying bees to better understand how populations are faring and how they can be supported. It's important work as Canada has about 1,000 species of bees, with more than a third of those in Manitoba doing the bulk of pollinating crops. But many of these bees and their counterpart pollinators, vital links in our food chain, are finding their efforts being challenged in a number of ways.
On the prairies, of course, the number of species changes from province to province. What was interesting is that when I started working on this, we would say that we had about 250 different species of pollinator in Manitoba, but we've seen that increase to about, well over 350 species of bee. It's not because there are more of them, it's just that we're getting better at finding them and identifying them. Bees aren't the only pollinators. There are butterflies and moths, syrphid flies, wasps, all play a role. We tend to focus on bees, though, simply because they do the bulk of the pollinating, as they eat pollen and nectar for the entirety of their life cycle, so they're not dependent on other types of lands. We're losing our shelter belts at an alarming rate, which, land prices are really high. There's not a lot of land available, and machinery is getting bigger, and that puts pressures on those more natural areas that perhaps were left in the past, and it's putting pressure on our shelter belts as that land goes into production. Shelter belts are really interesting because they play a role in providing food if they're a flowering shelter belt or if they're a multi-species shelter belt with undergrowth. But they also provide refugia for them to move out of the fields when there is disturbance and tillage, so they can survive in those field margins. And even if your shelter belt doesn't have a flowering component, oftentimes it can provide a barrier from the movement of pesticides from the ag fields into your more natural areas. So a well-designed multi-species shelter belt can really support your pollinators in a variety of ways. They're very important.
Approximately 80% of bees on the prairies make their nests in the ground, but a worrying trend in an overall decline in bee species, as much as 95% in at least one population of bumblebee, is often due to habitat loss. It is here, at the margins, that shelter belts can play an important role in providing a safe, temporary space for bees whose daily activities are disrupted.
The type of habitat that they need, though, is habitat that provides floral resources throughout the growing season, that is protected from pesticides and protected from tillage, because having a life style that relies on undisturbed ground, sometimes that's at a premium in the agricultural areas of the prairies. Overall, the causes of decline, we do have a fairly good idea that it's, of course, habitat loss. So when I say habitat, I mean habitat that is able to both feed, shelter, and protect them. There are issues with disease transmission from domestic herds, climate change. with issues with unpredictable weather, freeze-thaw cycles that impact the bees that emerge, say, in the spring or in the fall, and also more violent weather, which impacts their ability to fly and get food for their larvae. In order to grow one little bee, it might take up to 1,000 trips to a flower to provide for that one little bee. And if we're having gale force winds or super hot temperatures or things like that, that's going to reduce the ability for that bee to provision that one cell. We know that we need the pollinators, but it's that unknown factor of, how do you maintain competitiveness and a profitable operation while making sure that you are not damaging your operation by removing those natural areas.
That was GFM online editor Greg Berg speaking with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Melanie Dubois. Finally, we're going to return to the south of France to give the last word to apiarist Philip Pryor.
If you feel the sensitivity about that insect and everything that she does, people will sit down and say, my goodness me, I didn't know that. Because that's what it is. And that's the real truth about bees. We don't really have a great understanding about a lot of things about her. I mean, what I teach is very basic. It's out of the books. It's nothing. It's not rocket fuel science. It's purely just an understanding of something which is our number one indicator. It's our number one indicator for our environment.
You've been listening to a special edition of Between the Rows. I've been your host, Christy Nuds. The show was written by Bruce Thorson and produced by Laura Rance and Bruce Thorson. Thanks for listening.